Good morning. My name is Simon Peyton-Jones and I work at Microsoft's Research Lab in Cambridge, but I also have the privilege to be the chair of the National Centre for Computing Education, and today my task is to talk about digital skills in computing education. So digital skills is very much in the air at the moment. You hear a lot of talk about the digital skills gap, about essential digital skills, about the digital divide or digital skills in the workplace. But I think it's really important before we begin to understand what we mean by that term. If two people use the same word but are thinking about two different things, here one person's thinking about a camel and another person's thinking about a banana, they're not going to have a very productive conversation. So it's really important to nail down what it is that we are talking about when we use the term digital skills. So here is my attempt. Digital competence, I'm going to say why I'm using competence rather than skills here. Digital competence comprises the skills and knowledge that the user of a computer system needs to use that system effectively, to use it safely, and to make well-informed judgments about it. And I'm going to use the next few slides to unpack the meaning of this definition in a little bit more detail. Firstly, the focus here is on users, that is, people who are using a computer system to do some other job. They are not primary IT techies, they're doctors or bakers or geographers, and they have some other job to do, but they're using a computer to get it done. So the focus here is not on those of us geeks who build computer systems, important though they are, but on the users. Next, now digital competency comprises the skills and knowledge. Now here this is why I'm using the word competence rather than skills, because I can't really say digital skills comprises the skills and knowledge. So knowledge means what you know and understand. Skills means what you can do. So having lots of knowledge but no skill is a bit useless, right? Because you can't do anything. Having useful skills but without underpinning knowledge is kind of brittle, because the skills tend to be bound to particular technologies or ways of doing things. And when that changes, if you don't have any underpinning knowledge, you're a bit stuck. But if you have both skills and knowledge together, you are resilient to successive ways of technology. You can adapt and replan. So I think the word digital skills is already a bit of an unhelpful headline. I'd prefer to say digital competence, which is what the term the EU uses. We might choose some other term, digital literacy perhaps. Choose your term, but I really want to emphasize skills and knowledge. One without the other doesn't work. Skills and knowledge for the user of a computer system to use it effectively. So obviously we want to use systems effectively, but here I mean lots of different things. Right, one thing is pick the right tools. If you're a carpenter and you want to bang in a nail, you don't use a saw or a plane, you use a hammer. But that means you need to know what different tools are available and what they're all good for. And that's true about in the digital space as well, very much. Secondly, you need to use it well. So you need to be a skilled user of that plane or that hammer or that file. How many times, for example, have you seen people modify the individual paragraphs of a Word document, changing font or indentation or layout, when if they understood that there is this somewhat behind the scenes notion of a style that's attached to a paragraph, and you can set lots of attributes of a style, and then for a new paragraph you can say I'd like it to be in style A, B or C, and lots of things would change at once. When you understand that underlying abstraction and that ability, you can be much more effective as a Word user, but yet you can kind of get the job done without it, and lots of people never learn that, which I think is a shame. So using it well means understanding enough about the stuff that lies beneath the surface. It's I sometimes think it's a bit like the Loch Ness Monster, right? If you see the Loch Ness Monster wandering about Loch Ness, you've got these hoops above the surface, and they're sort of thundering around on the surface. But once you understand that underneath the surface, there's these bits of monster that sort of connect it up, the connective tissue, if you like, then it makes sense of the bits that break the surface. So in the same way, once you understand the underlying model that a particular computer system is using, how it fits together underneath the surface, it makes a lot more sense of what it can do. It makes you much more able to know how to make it do something new that you hadn't thought of before. Another thing we might want to do is to be resilient to dealing with errors. Here, if the computer system does exactly what you want smoothly, then that's all fine, and often they do. But quite often they also, there's some problem or error or situation that you haven't met before, that it wasn't designed for, and then knowing how to deal resiliently with that is super important. Overall, though, it means being the master of the tool rather than its slave, so that you're in control rather than being controlled by it. Next thing, digital competence means that you can use the system safely. So this, I think, we're all quite well aware of. We need to know what risks there are, particularly when connected to the internet, of phishing attacks or password theft or data loss. And we need to know what risks we should worry about, and also what risks we should not worry about. People are often unjustifiably concerned that if they press the red button or click the wrong thing, that their entire file will disappear, or even that their computer will be damaged. And often they don't need to worry about that. They're needlessly anxious. So knowing what risks to worry about and what not to is important, and also knowing what countermeasures to take. That is, what measures do you take to stay safe online, and that you can be reasonably confident that you are. So again, you don't have that underlying gut feeling of insecurity about thinking at any moment that bad things might happen to you. Last thing, and this is almost the most important, digital competence is the skills and knowledge that you need to make well-informed judgments about computer systems. So this ranges from whether or when to use a computer system at all to achieve a given goal, and also what risks there might be in using it. And here I'm not talking about the risk from malevolent attackers that I was talking about in the previous slide, but rather the risks to privacy, the risks to reliance on a single central point of failure, the risks to what would happen if the computer completely crashed and lost all your data, and how might you mitigate those risks. The risk to what happens if the only person who knows about how it works leaves. So there's lots of things you might concern about that are not so much technical things, they're more how it fits into your organization. That's really important. Another question that's about making well-informed judgments is knowing what level of trust to place in the system. And I think we're probably all becoming quite familiar with stories about computer systems that are being used to make judgments, to decide whether to issue insurance to somebody or a passport, to take judgments about their life that then inform human beings and what they do. But those systems might be based on data that simply isn't true. They might be based on machine learning algorithms that have been given data that is biased towards one particular population, but then it's being used for another. And when people know nothing about how a computer system works, they tend to think it's just magic. Computer says yes, must be true, right? How could it not be? Whereas once you've learned a bit about how computers work, you realize, oh man, it's amazing that they work at all, actually, given how easy it is to put bugs in our programs or to give it data that isn't sufficiently comprehensive. So I think it's very healthy to have a well-informed notion of the level of trust that you should place in a computer system. And lastly, there's the broader ethical and social implications of using computer systems, things like privacy and trust at scale, about how we share our data with large companies and what use they make of it, and what effect that has on the society we live in, and even very large scale things like the threats to democracy. So I'd like our children to grow up with a critical awareness of these kind of things and a sufficiently well-informed information base to have good conversations about this kind of stuff, rather than just, well, that's for somebody in a white coat to take a judgment about. So the domain I'm particularly interested in is, what should our children learn about digital competence? And it's a bit tempting to say, we should tear up the curriculum and look carefully at what should happen for digital competence and have a whole strand about that. But I just want to give a sense of perspective here. Here's one way to look at it. When people talk about digital competencies and skills, what they're usually thinking about is the stuff that breaks through the surface of the water. So here I'm thinking about applications like mobile phones or aerospace or medical or your home computer, right? Lots and lots of them. We come across it all the time. It changes very rapidly. It tends to be focused very much about particular devices and systems, and it's often focused around individual users or companies or institutions that are using information technology for a particular purpose. So this is what I mean by breaking the surface. It's using technology for a particular purpose, products and services. But underneath the surface, there are at least two more layers. The bottom layer is a foundational layer of the subject discipline itself. Here, the subject discipline is called computer science. It's the study of information, computation, and communication. Note, not data, algorithms, and networks. Right? So it's the domain of principles and ideas, and they don't change very quickly, actually. These principles and ideas, and it's the proper bailiwick of schools and universities, of our education system generally, to give all children a foundational understanding of the natural world and the digital world that surrounds them. You could draw exactly the same picture here for natural science or for mathematics. Then the layer above is when we turn those foundational ideas into reality. So this is where we start to talk about actual computers, hardware and software. We talk about technology, we talk about programming. It's the domain not so much of educational institutions, but of companies that will turn foundational ideas into products and services that are useful to real people to get real jobs done. The arrows on the right of this slide are meant to suggest that a minority of young people will turn into the engineers of the future, the people who will turn all these ideas into reality. The majority will become doctors or plumbers or health workers who will use this technology but still need this underpinning knowledge in order to be effective, safe, and judicious users. So the overall message I'm trying to convey here is that robust, resilient digital competence that everybody needs is underpinned by an understanding of the technology, the engineering layer that underlies it, and that in turn is underpinned by the foundational knowledge and understanding, at least at an elementary level, of the subject discipline that underlies it. And so I think that every child should acquire some elementary foundational knowledge of computer science, just as they do of mathematics and natural science, and for exactly the same reason, because it empowers them and gives them agency in the world, rather than treating it all as magic. So we don't need to tear up the national curriculum. We have one that does cover this spectrum. Here, the National Curriculum for Computing only comprises 2 sides of A4, so it's very readable for anybody listening to this talk. And here are the 4 aims of the National Curriculum in Computing. This is verbatim, right? That all children from primary school should be able to understand and apply the fundamental principles of computer science, that they should be able to analyze problems in computational terms through that computational lens and have repeated experience of writing programs to solve them. But moving up the layers more towards application, that they should evaluate, that's the well-founded judgment, well-informed judgment. They should evaluate and apply information technology, including ones as they change, to solve problems, and that they should be responsible, competent, creative users of technology. So that covers the whole stack that I've just described. So I've come to think of the computing education in this way. I see that computing as a school subject as resting on 2 pillars. The one pillar is it's a foundational subject that every child should learn just as they do natural science. And the other is that it's a subject that will equip our children not only for the jobs of the future, but for their lives as citizens of the future. I really like this quote from Richard Riley in the middle, that our education is meant to prepare young people for jobs that don't yet exist, using technologies that have not yet been invented to solve problems of which we are not yet aware. And I think that if we treat our computing education in this way, rather than as a very technology-driven subject, I think we'll succeed. So arising out that children who come through an excellent education of this form will then be both the software developers and the scientists, engineers, lawyers and plumbers, or the whole spectrum, as all children will go through this route. And they will then have digital competence that will span a wide variety, ranging right the way from the creators of the future, the software developers of the future, if you like, through to those who will use and modify systems that other people have built, to those that will be users who will still be informed by a well-grounded understanding of those systems. But I want to stress here the spectrum of digital competencies that we might hope that our children will emerge with. And different children will want to specialize and go deeper in different levels. So that's all very high level. I just wanted to move very briefly to a little vignette of the kind of thing that I hope we might be able to achieve through this. This is a workshop in London that was held a few years ago, led by Miles Berry, who's in this picture. And in this workshop, a primary school child who's here called M realised that she could replace a sequence of 8 commands, which made a little turtle graphics thing draw a square, by a sequence of just 2 wrapped in a for loop that repeated those 2 commands 4 times. And nobody had ever taught her this. She just saw it on the palette of commands that she could do, guessed what it could do, tried it out, and sure enough it worked, and she was able to explain it to her group and took it back to her school. So there's an element of sort of experimental and also being able to try things out in a very in a way that didn't risk anything. But also being able to make a computer do something that it hadn't been able to do, at least not from her before. The thing I particularly like about this story is what her teacher wrote to Miles some weeks later to say. He said this: "Here I have M, self-esteem going through the roof. She has associated this computing success with mathematics. Over the last couple of weeks, she's solved problem after problem, met target after target. She's truly flying. She is going great because of a positive experience in a computing workshop in London." And what I love about this is the sense this was a primary school child who'd gained a sense of self-efficacy, of being in control of the situation and be able to do something herself, that she was then able to leverage into applying to another subject, in this case mathematics. And I hope that sense of agency has stayed with her for a long time. And it's that thing, being in control, being able to tackle new things with confidence, that I'm so keen that our children should learn. So, story so far: we don't need to reform the national curriculum, we just need to make it into a vibrant reality in every classroom in the land. Now that is not easy. In 2017, 3 years after the launch of the national curriculum, the new national curriculum, the Royal Society released this report called After the Reboot. There was really a kind of state of the nation summary of how things were going across the country. And the report concluded there was a lot to celebrate, that more children are learning more good stuff about computing than they had done before, but that the whole thing was patchy and fragile. That is, it was delivered very well in some schools and much less well in others. And even in the schools in which it was going quite well, it wasn't as deeply rooted and embedded and secure as a subject like French or physics. So why is that? It's partly because teachers at the moment have an extremely hard job. They're faced with pressures from all manner of directions, not least at the moment COVID. But even COVID aside, being a teacher is quite a hard job. But if we can equip our teachers to be passionate and inspired and have a deep understanding of this vision of computing as a school subject, they can in turn inspire literally thousands of students. Many of us, I think, can think back to teachers that inspired them in the past. Even now, we can probably remember them. But if being a teacher is hard, being a computer teacher at the moment is particularly hard. The subject's in flux. Making it become mainstream does have implications right across the educational system. And while we've been teaching many subjects for centuries, like maths, and we still are not quite sure what the best way to teach it is, computing as a school subject we really haven't been teaching for very long. So our whole notion of pedagogy, what order to learn things in, how to teach them best, is still in fairly early stages. Also, computing teachers are typically thin on the ground, at least ones who have any computer science background are thin on the ground. And a teacher looked at me recently and said, well, in my school, it's me, or me. And that sense of isolation can be quite demoralizing. I think we owe it to our teachers to support and equip them to do a good job here. So that is the role of the National Centre for Computing Education. It arose fairly directly after that Royal Society report, after the restart. And it was the role of the National Centre is precisely to give the sort of professional development and support to our teachers that they deserve and need. So it's a 4-year program funded by the Department for Education. The money was announced across the whole of the UK. This was in late 2017, but the slice that was directed to England was about £84 million. That's quite a lot of money. It was to cover the whole spectrum from primary right through to A-level, but the scale is large, right? In this country, there are 3,500 secondary schools, 16,000 primary schools, and 6 million children in education through between 6 and 18 at any one time. That's a lot of children. So how does the National Centre work? So it's a big top-down initiative, right? Driven by this £20 million a year fund from the Department for Education. It's run by a consortium of 3 existing organisations. The NCCE is not a new legal entity. It's a consortium of BCS, the Chartered Institute for IT that's running this very conference, the Raspberry Pi Foundation, who many of you will have heard about, and STEM Learning, who already deliver training at scale to science and math teachers. So these 3 organisations got together, made a bid to deliver this programme, and the department awarded it to them. But they, in turn, dovetail with another big group of people, and that is the Computing at School community of practice. So it's rather longer lived. It started in about 2008, and it's a loosely knit group of volunteers and school teachers and IT professionals and software developers and academics who together share a common passion to reform and bring life into the computing as taught at school. So it's very much volunteer-driven, bottom-up community of practice. The NCCE is a big top-down initiative, and they sort of dovetail together to form the NCCE. So the National Centre has been producing a lot of online and face-to-face courses, which are offered at low cost to all schools. It's developed a huge collection of curriculum resources, so 500 hours of lesson plans and homework assignments and practical exercises and all the supporting material, all driven from the best research that we have available. So that's a big top-down part, and then that's mediated through Computing at School to computing teachers around the country. So that's roughly how the NCCE works. So the NCCE has started about 2 years ago and has reached around half the primary schools in the country in some way. Most of the secondary schools, do you remember I said there were 3,500 secondary schools? And a really large number of teachers have engaged with the NCCE in some way or another. The CAS local communities I mentioned, which are these volunteer-led community groups, there's about nearly 300 of those, but there's also, this is the top-down part, 34 computing hubs which are based in schools and act as the local beacon for the National Centre in their particular locality. But that leads me to ask, how can we, the computing professionals of the country, help with all of this? And I think we should. So this is our subject. This is a time of inspiration and opportunity, but it's also a time of anxiety and stress. And that's not only because of COVID. There's any big change like this in a national curriculum and a big new ask for teachers to do things that they've never previously been trained for or asked to do is a big ask of them. So there's a lot to play for because the ice has melted. Everything is in flux at the moment. The ice floes are moving around. If we play a role now, I think we can help the ice to eventually settle into an education for our children that we can all be proud of. But I think there's a danger that we'll all just fold our arms and say, well, thank goodness, the cavalry has come to the rescue. The National Centre for Computing Education is here. We can just go back to our screens and let the NCCE get on with it. But actually, the NCCE is indeed awesome. It is an amazing initiative, but it is not omnipotent. £80 million over 4 years divided among 20,000 schools is really only about £1,000 per school per year. That's enough to make a very significant difference, but it will not solve the problem. I think we can wait for somebody else to do something about this, or we can roll up our sleeves and try to do something ourselves. And I really think we should do B. So what can we do? Here are some things. Firstly, we can speak up for the importance and value of a computing education, broadly conceived in the way that I've tried to frame it in this talk, for every child. Not just as a narrow, we need to know where the items in Word are, in Word menus, but this broad underpinning education to inform well-informed judgments and choices about computing systems. Secondly, we can share awareness about the National Centre and about computing at school among school leaders and teachers, and all of us are in touch with schools in some way or another. Many of us, because we have children, it's very direct. Some it's a little bit more remote, but all of us, it's open to us to make approaches to school teachers or school leaders and try to get alongside them and say, how can we help? And point them towards the resources the National Centre has. We can volunteer for quite a few computing education initiatives in schools. So I've listed some here: Code Club, Barefoot Computing, STEM Ambassadors. There are hard links to all of these on the web page whose URL I put at the bottom here. And these are all existing programs you can just plug into and offer some time to. You don't have to invent everything from scratch, is what I'm trying to say. You can offer enrichment activities to schools, to your local schools, talks. You can be mentoring visit. You can offer to mentor a teacher, or indeed children, mediated through the context of the school. Offering teachers and children the opportunity to visit your workplace can be fantastically helpful and motivating, both for teachers and for students. So there's quite a lot you can do here by way of enrichment through, again, some of the same kind of programs. STEM Ambassadors is very good on this. And lastly, we can offer funding to help schools. If you've ever been to a school, you will know how strapped they are for cash all the time. Just being helpful locally can be really helpful. And at the other end of the spectrum, the National Centre has a bursary fund to support teachers to take NCCE courses, because it costs money to get them out of school to pay for cover, for example. That's really important. I think we can work hard to do things together rather than individually. As individual atomized people, we can help, but I think if we work together, we can be more reliable and sustained as partners for schools, so that to avoid ourselves parachuting in and then not then being sent away somewhere else, or having a priority job that has to be done, and then suddenly the school's bereft. And I think if we gather together in groups, we can also be influential in our own companies, who I think are often very supportive, particularly when the initiative comes from inside the company rather than as a begging from outside. But I do think you have to take a lead, right? If you wait for somebody else to lead, you may be waiting a long time. Start a group, encourage others to share with you, brainstorm ideas and form relationships with local schools, but work through these other programs. So here's a few quick guidelines. Being proactive, I've already mentioned. Being sustained, I've already mentioned too, but it's really important. If we just are very enthusiastic for a few weeks, get a school all excited and then disappear, we've done more harm than good. Please don't reinvent the wheel. Teachers are faced with a lot of offers for stuff, and it's quite bewildering if there's too much, especially if it comes and goes. So if you can join in some existing program that's already executing at scale across the country, that can be a lot easier for teachers and actually a lot more supportive from you than inventing something from scratch that might or might not meet the need. Lastly, be aware that we need to be humble. Education is very complicated and rife with unintended consequences. So we need to have humility about this. We are not the cavalry riding to the rescue. We are supporters who want to get alongside our schools and our teachers and just offer our help in the way that is best for them, and listening very carefully to what they're saying to us. We do not have all the answers. In fact, probably nobody has all the answers, but if we work together, I think we could do much better than if we just wade in with the solution that we first thought of. But the last thing really is, do something. Do something. If, as a result of this talk, you just think, well, that's great, I hope somebody does something, that might be okay, but it'd be so much better if thousands of people, all of the software developers and IT professionals and academics around the country, can just do something. Each of us together, we can make a big difference. This is a scale problem, right? With that number of schools, that number of teachers, that number of children, there are no silver bullets. We need scale. So I just want to finish here by returning to our children. They are the focus here, and it is their futures we're trying to enable. It's their future empowerment that we're trying to work on here. I want our children to be engaged and curious about the amazingly exciting and rich world of computation and information that surrounds them. I want them to see it not as a dry academic thing, but a subject in which they can be creative and playful and express themselves. I want them to be empowered and informed so they make good choices and feel that they are in control of their lives. And yes, I do want them to be employed as well, and I think that a good computing education will give them routes into really quite rewarding employment with many of the people perhaps listening to this talk. So I'll just leave you with this URL. At the end, the first one is this the how to get involved link for the National Centre, and the second is a sort of collection of bookmarks that I've collected of relevant information in this area. So thank you very much for listening. Please do take a moment to think about how you might take action on some of this. Thank you very much.